All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Eric Anderson. I'm a field crops educator with Michigan State. I'm down in the southwest corner of the state, and I'll be your host this morning. Phil tells me that my audio might not be all that great with my video on, so he told me to turn the video off. I think he's probably got ulterior motives there, but I'll turn the video off so that you don't have to look at me. So thanks for joining. We're going to go ahead and get started. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we start. Please mute yourself during the presentations. That way everyone will be able to hear the presenter unhindered. If you are planning on asking for RUP credits, I would ask that you would sign in with your first and last name. So if you've never had to do that before, just click on the participant list at the bottom of the screen. Find your name, hover over it, and then click more, and then rename yourself. All morning long, feel free to put any questions that you've got in the chat, and that chat is located at the bottom of the screen. And we'll take care of all of the credits RUP and also the CCA credits right after the presentations, right around 7:30 or so. The MSU Extension programs are open to all. The collection of demographic data from program participants is an important and mandated aspect of all Michigan State University Extension programming. This is voluntary, and the information that you provide will not be used in any way personally, but rather as a member of a group that participated in this program. A link will be shared in the chat, and we ask that you take a moment to fill that out if you'd like. I appreciate that. So this morning, we get to hear from Dr. Christy Sprague. If you've been joining us for the entire season, you know that she kind of kicked us off in the spring with some spring weed challenges. Now she's going to wrap up or come close to wrapping up our season, talking about some considerations for fall scouting and weed management. So Christy, thanks for joining us, and I'll have you take over.
Thanks, Eric, and good morning, everyone. As Eric said, we started out at the beginning of the season talking about ways that we could manage weeds, and thought we would be all set, but it has been a challenge this year. So as we start thinking about moving forward to this fall, as well as thinking about what we might do in 2022, I thought it might be important to kind of do a quick review of what we've seen this year as far as weed control. Obviously, it has been challenging. We have seen that some of the dry conditions that we experienced early really caused some reductions in weed control, basically because our pre-emergence herbicides weren't working like they needed to because of the lack of precipitation or rain. And additionally, when we got around to late June, we had some of those excessive rainfalls into late June, early July, and that has really kind of picked up a lot of the weed escapes that we've seen later in the season. So as you start thinking about the weather that you experienced in your area, some of the challenges that we've had is that late rainfall really caused a germination and emergence of some of our later season weeds, and some of the early dry weather that we had, some of those herbicides weren't working quite as well. So as we're driving around right now, a lot of the weeds that we're seeing that have escaped control are things like velvet leaf, some common lamb's quarters, both common and giant ragweed. We do see quite a bit of fields out there of horseweed, mare's tail. And then we are seeing a few fields with palmer amaranth, but really seeing kind of an explosion of water hemp. So if you see the picture here on the slide, this is a field that is kind of a field where water hemp hasn't been noticed before. So it was corn last year. There may have been one or two plants, and you can see there's just kind of a small area that's where water hemp has come up this year. So these are some of the things that we need to think about as we kind of go into harvest. So in looking at that, these are some pictures that were taken yesterday of just some different soybean fields. You can see at the top we have some common ragweed escapes, also some lamb's quarter escapes down in the left-hand corner, and then you can see a water hemp field there. So one of the things that's that we want to do is kind of think about, well, what can we do right now? Well, we know it's it's really too late to do any in-season herbicide applications. Right now is a good time to really start scouting for those weed escapes and trying to prepare for next year and see what are some of the things that we might want to do. One of the things I would recommend is going out and looking at a lot of your fields and kind of evaluate the effectiveness of your herbicide program that you had this year. Are you seeing some of those weed escapes? What are those weed escapes? And really trying to think if there are new weeds that are showing up in some of those fields. So for example, on this slide, we have a soybean field where cocklebur has pretty much infested it. So that would be kind of a newer weed that we don't see a whole lot of. So thinking about what might be some of the management strategies that we might do for 2022. So again, now's a perfect time to start scouting for those weed escapes. Also, when you're in your combine harvesting, that's another place to note to where you might see some of those escapes. The other thing is we do know that a lot of these escapes may be due to resistance issues. So I thought I'd spend a little bit of time talking about some of the herbicide resistance problems that we've seen in Michigan, as well as what you can do about that moving forward. So here's a pretty inclusive list of all the different herbicide resistant weeds that we have in Michigan. Currently, we have 21 different weed species that have developed resistance to at least 5 different herbicide sites of action. While you look at this list, you see we have quite a different number of weed species that have developed resistance to the triazine herbicides, things like atrazine. Also the ALS herbicides, the group 2 herbicides are also ones where we have quite a big extensive list. As you look at this, the ones that we usually are pretty more concerned about are the ones that are glyphosate resistant. So things like horseweed, Palmer amaranth, common ragweed, and giant ragweed. But in addition to that, over the last couple of years, we've actually identified a few more weeds that have another resistance, which is to the PPO inhibitors. So if you think about what those herbicides are, those are things like Cobra, Ultra Blazer, Flexstar, Reflex, things that we may use in soybeans or potentially dry beans. So with those challenges, and we start seeing a lot of these similar weed species, one of the other things we see is that many of these weeds are not just resistant to one of these herbicide sites of action, but to multiple. So that makes it really challenging when we start thinking about how we're going to manage some of these weeds during the 2022 season. So as I mentioned, some of those weed escapes may be due to herbicide resistance. So when should you test to see if a weed is resistant to some of those herbicides? So one of the things that I always think about is, should that herbicide program have worked on managing that weed? So if I know that I have a pretty extensive program where I'm using multiple herbicide sites of action, and it should have killed that weed, or if I know that, Roundup has worked in the past, it should have killed it. Those are some of the things where I want to think about maybe taking some samples and getting those tested. Some of the things we want to think about and not necessarily looking at getting those weeds tested is, as I said, we had some dry conditions early. Some of those pre-herbicides didn't work as well. So if we were relying totally on those pre's to control those weeds, it may have those weed escapes may have been due to that. The other thing is if we have some weeds that came up late. So for example, Eastern Black Nightshade seems to come up a lot after our last post-emergence herbicide. We're seeing a lot of that this year because of the late rain that we had and some of the issues with that. When we really want to test for resistance is if we know if we have an unknown or uncommon resistant weed profile in the area. Some of the common ones that we see is glyphosate and ALS resistant horseweed, mare's tail, water hemp, or Palmer amaranth. So in that case, if you have water hemp that shows up, you probably might as well just bank on it being resistant to glyphosate and probably an ALS inhibitor. But there are also some other resistance profiles that can happen. So when we want to get those tested is when we have some of those less uncommon issues. So for example, we do have a few fields of glyphosate resistant common and giant ragweed, but it's not widespread throughout the state. So it might be important to go ahead and get those tested if you have those weed escapes. Also, if we were trying to rely on a PPO inhibitor or atrazine, and we're starting to see, and tank mixes with glyphosate, and we're seeing those weed escapes, you may want to get those tested. And then obviously other species that aren't controlled that you think should have been controlled. And our plant diagnostic clinic on campus, we have a weed diagnostician, Dr. Erin Hill, and she does a lot of testing for herbicide resistance. So I thought I would give you a little bit of an update on how you can send those samples in. So for example, what Erin does is what you would do is collect 5 or more weeds with mature seed. And she has put together a great fact sheet called Tips for Collecting Mature Weeds that has this table, shows you what the weed seeds look like and what color they should be when they're mature. So for example, with water hemp, usually you're looking for the dark brown or black seed from a female plant. And then let's say you're collecting some from mare's tail, you would be looking for the seed to be brown and not white. So those are some of the mature seeds that she would need for testing. The other thing she would ask that you do is you send those in a paper bag. You want to use a paper bag to make sure that there is no molding. Also want to include a submission form. Those submission forms can be found on the Pest ID MSU.edu website, as well as in the weed control guide. So those submission forms are there. And then if you could send those, usually before November, she likes to have everything ready to go by November 15th. So as you're collecting your weed seeds, go ahead and get those sent in and she will be able to test those. Those can either be mailed to the diagnostic services or brought in person to the diagnostic services lab at Michigan State University. And you can see that address here, but you can also get that from the submission form. And really the process of testing for resistance is really making sure that you clean the seed, or she will clean the seed, and then basically plant that, apply herbicide applications at both the 1x and 4x rate, and let you know if there's resistance. In general, she usually tests about 6 or 7 different herbicide sites of action, so you know which herbicides will work in controlling that weed species. One of the great things is the Michigan Soybean Promotion Committee has supported the testing of several of these weed species if you find them in your soybean field. So if you have a soybean field where you have some of these escapes, things like palmer amaranth, water hemp, common lamb's quarters, horseweed, and both giant ragweed species. You can also get other species tested, but a lot of times you will have to pick up the cost of that, and I believe it's around $90 per sample. And again, for more information, you can go to the Pest ID site or msuweeds.com or contact Erin directly. So what else can be done? So we know we've got a lot of weed escapes that have happened this year. One thing to think about is if you're driving by a field and you happen to see kind of a small patch of weeds, it doesn't take too much long to try to remove those weeds by hand. Really to get those out of there, particularly the ones that we think might be resistant. So for example, this is a few palmer amaranth plants in a soybean field. If we remove those by hand before combining, basically we're not spreading that seed around, and knowing that we can have up to 400,000 seeds on each plant, that'll help prevent a big mess. Another issue is if you have a field that has quite a bit of resistant weeds, one thing you might want to consider is harvesting around that weedy area, or also harvesting that weedy field last to make sure that you're not spreading those herbicide resistant weeds from field to field. Additionally, there are some harvest dates that can be used in soybeans. I will just put those up. They're not really commonly used, but in some cases, if you have certain weed species that are green, you might be able to help desiccate those weeds. Here's a list of those, as well as the use rates and pre-harvest intervals. We have a whole section on this in the weed control guide, so if you're interested in looking at those a little bit more closely, you can go to pages 110 or 111 and 111. And with pre-harvest treatments, I also thought I might just bring up the use in dry beans, because we do use those a lot, and that is actually happening right now as we're harvesting dry beans. And again, these are really to help manage some of those weeds that may interfere with harvest, but it also helps with the unevenness of the maturity of dry beans. So it basically dries those dry beans down. We pretty much have 4 different herbicides we can use in dry beans: Gramoxone, Valor, AIM, and Sharpen. With Sharpen, we want to use a methylated seed oil. Sharpen has probably been one of our, Sharpen and Gramoxone have been our kind of more consistent products. We've also done some tank mixtures that have worked out well. We can use up to 2 ounces of Sharpen, but in general, we see 1 ounce being as effective as 2 ounces. And again, that would have to have a methylated seed oil with it. And we really see that that application by itself works well in controlling things like ragweed and pigweed species. However, if we're going to desiccate lamb's quarters, that tank mixture with Gramoxone is needed. The one thing that's a little bit of a challenge is some of the restrictions that we now have on Gramoxone as far as the added certification to make those applications. One other thing I do want to mention is we did see a little bit of issues with the 2 ounce rate with Sharpen in the past, in this last year, because it was dry. And just to remind you that if you're going to go to something like sugar beets or dry beans, which is usually not recommended, we want to make sure that we're using that 1 ounce rate. That 1 ounce rate has a rotation restriction that is less. It's at 4 months, and we need to make sure that we're not including the rotation interval where the ground is frozen. So you can see here in the front, there was 2 ounces of Sharpen and caused some setback in the sugar beets. That has also been seen with in dry beans following a desiccation treatment of dry beans the following year. One other quick thing I just wanted to mention is there are fall herbicide applications that we can use to help manage some of the winter annual weeds. In particular, we'll talk about horseweed or mare's tail, since this is the biggest issue. Once a field like this is harvested, a lot of times you will see new mare's tail plants after harvest, and sometimes it's a good idea to get those controlled. In controlling those, really what we want to do is help reduce that variability from spring herbicide treatments. In some cases, we will need another spring burn down, but definitely would need a residual to get some of those late season emergence. You can see here's a fall burn down compared to no fall burn down. Here are some of the options that you can use to manage mare's tail, things like 2,4-D ester, Sharpen, dicamba. In general, a lot of times we want to make sure that we tank mix those with glyphosate and AMS, and that really helps improve control of some of the other winter annual weeds, as well as controlling some of the perennials such as dandelion, and that's a great time to do that. And just one last thing I want to mention is as we're planting wheat, it's going to be important to control some of those winter annuals or perennials that may be out there at the time of planting. So if you're one of those ones that go through, harvest your soybeans or dry beans, and then plant right away into it, it's a really good idea to think about trying to manage those weeds before that crop gets up, before the wheat crop gets up. This last year, we had a study where we're comparing a lot of different conventional tillage, no-till with a fall burn down. In this case, we used 1 ounce of Sharpen and Roundup, and then no-till without a fall burn down. And you can see the yield at the end of the season, where we were seeing quite a bit of a benefit to either the conventional till or the no-till with the fall burn down. So with that, just want to remind you, we do have several resources available in the weed control guide, as well as our website, msuweeds.com. And with that, I will turn it over to Jeff.
Thanks. Or back to Eric, maybe.
So for those of you who are not monitoring the chat, I'll just highlight a couple of things. Erin Hill, who Christy had alluded to earlier, she put a couple of things in, some links to some fact sheets and some other resources. So if you have, particularly for resistance issues, go ahead and check out the links in the chat. There was a back and forth about rough stalk bluegrass. Question was, is there an effective herbicide program? And Christy responded to that. Osprey applications post in the fall have provided good control of rough stalk bluegrass, and early spring applications of Osprey or axial bold have been slightly better. And Aaron and Christy also put a link to the MSU weeds website into the chat, so feel free to follow that link as well. Here's one question for you, Christy. Is there an effective fall herbicide program for weed control, either broadleaf or grass, in winter wheat that would allow June clover frost seeding in the spring?
Sure. So most of our fall herbicide applications, like a Husky, Telenor, Axial Bold, Osprey, Powerflex, all those different herbicides can be applied in the fall post-emergence. So usually you want to wait until the wheat has 1 to 2 leaves. Some of them are 3 leaf. It depends on the product. And all of those we've been able to frost seed clover. We may see some reduction in clover establishment, but it is able to take off. And we've got those recommendations in each one of those products in the weed guide. So if you look up the information, kind of the remarks and limitation section, it'll say whether it can be applied in the fall and then frost seed clover. So that's some of the information that we do have. In the spring, for spring applications, the only thing you can use is MCPA or Axial Bold.
Okay, thanks, Christy. So I forgot to mention that if you do have any questions for Jeff, he is actually going to be teaching here pretty quick, and so he might need to leave a couple minutes early. So if you've got any questions for Jeff, go ahead and put those in the chat. And Jeff, we do have one. Why are minimum nighttime temperatures getting higher, do you think?
Yeah, excellent question, and thanks for the follow-up. It's probably a couple things. The two biggest factors physically, an increase possibly in cloudiness. Remember that the clouds overnight keep our air temperatures a little bit warmer than they would be otherwise. The second one's related, but it's also another physical factor, and that's the humidity is increasing. The amount of water vapor in the atmosphere is increasing, and so we don't get quite as much cooling at night because of that. That's at least the standard thought here now as to why we're seeing that. And it's Michigan and the Great Lakes region, not the only place that's happening. That's fairly common around, especially around the mid-latitudes of the world. Good question, though.
And Jeff, as a follow-up, Phil asks, maybe could the smoke that you had alluded to earlier in the season from out west there, could that have any impact on the nighttime temps?
It could. It's right on the rationale. It's probably a bigger factor during the daytime when we're getting more blockage and reflection of incoming solar radiation. So it could affect the nighttime, but it's probably more a factor during the day. And we saw some of that this year, especially to our west in places like Wisconsin and Minnesota, where we actually had a little bit cooler daytime maximum temperatures because of all the haze and smoke. There just wasn't as much solar radiation getting down to the ground surface as the case typically. So yeah, that is another factor, but probably more of an issue during the day.
Okay. So I know the medium term, the longer lead outlooks are usually kind of stinky for precipitation. But Clay asks if you have any sense as to what our moisture might look like for wheat planting, maybe mid to late September.
I think it's going to depend a lot on location and where you are. Here locally, it's been amazing. And we think about how much rain we've had in typical southern lower Michigan, many spots, much above normal rainfall going back. Christy talked about this all the way back to late June, and then through July and August, or at least the early part of August. It has dried out again, at least the topsoil. And I think that's the key is what's up there in the top of the profile. And right now, it's gotten, in many spots, especially with coarse textured soils, it's gotten a little dry again. And given the outlook, it probably is not going to get much much of a change over the next week or two. We'll see what happens next week. But northern parts of the state look great. There, the moisture's been more consistent and actually heavier, relatively heavier. So some of it depends on location. But I right now, I don't see any kind of a long-term widespread wet pattern, certainly in the offing, even though it did mention above normal precip in the 6 to 10 day outlook. There aren't a lot of other signs of that. So if anything, we may have some areas again on I think on the coarser soils where the surface dryness is something you're gonna have to watch. That would be and it isn't a huge concern, but something to watch here over the next few weeks.
Okay. Back to the question of nighttime temperatures. Here's an interesting one. What about added asphalt keeping temperatures warmer at night, maybe with increased urbanization?
Right. And that certainly is a factor in areas, large metropolitan areas. It's a known issue with our temperature series, especially in places where what was rural in character here physically several decades ago now is either suburban or in some cases even more developed than that. And those features like asphalt and concrete certainly absorb heat and then, of course, re-radiate that at night and create things or cause things to be warmer. That has to be taken into account, and you can actually see warming occur. It's real warming, but it's more due to the landscape change than the climate change. But we also see, though, some of what we see or we've been talking about, we also see that at rural stations too that do not have that. So if you're in an urban area, it's even more. I think that's the bottom line. There's even more of a nighttime and actually a daytime increase in temperature due to the change of the landscape and more non-paved concrete, et cetera, surfaces than those covered by plant material. So it's a definitely an issue. It's a good question.
Okay. So Christy, I've got a question for you. We've seen a lot of volunteer corn and in some cases pretty extensive in fields this year. And I know a lot of folks might think that, well, it's not going to be a continuing and ongoing weed issue. And so they may not feel the need to control that. Do we have any resources, any studies that would try to quantify a certain number of corn volunteer per given area that would have a certain yield impact, anything like that?
Yeah, Eric, we haven't done any related to soybeans in Michigan, but I do know there have been some in other states that can show yield loss. And I know we've done some in sugar beets and in Michigan, and we have been able to quantify that, and there is yield loss from that volunteer corn. So it's pretty simple to manage. There are a few, just throwing in some Select or other clethodim type products with the post-emergence applications, pretty effective at controlling volunteer corn. So it's just one of those things at the time of spraying post-emergence herbicides we need to think about.
Okay. I don't have any other questions in the chat, so I'm going to ask one more time if anyone has questions to put those in right now. And I will open it up to other specialists who are on. Anyone else have any insights or anything they'd like us to know about heading into this weekend?
Eric, I'm not sure if Chris DeFonso was still on, but I would appreciate an update on the armyworms and whether or not some of the planted wheat that's going to be in the ground here in the next couple of weeks should be at risk for these armyworms.
I'm actually going to jump in real quick if that's okay, because Tilly's got to get going to daycare here. But Chris DeFonso and I, Chris worked on this with Ohio State University, and I just made it possible by posting it online. But we have insect guides now available. They're if you go to the Field Crops team page, and you'll see right on the top, there's a new tab that says Insect Guides. It's the second one. You click on that, and they're listed by commodity. There is a link at the top, the very first one, that kind of gives you a little tutorial on how the guides are laid out. But besides that, I mean, Chris, you can give some details if you want, but they're all up there for you guys to use.
Yeah, so this is an update of the old E1582 guide that's like 10 years old. And I always hated that guide because it was just a list of pesticides. So Tilly and Monica have helped to post those chapters, and we've arranged it so that it can be updated continuously. So if you're an industry folks and you perhaps see that a product isn't listed, like we were able to remove Lorsban very quickly last week before we even posted it. And then you just print the sections that you need. So print how to use this guide section and then print, corn and beans, or maybe you have sugar beets. I realize it's, at the end of the season rather than the beginning, but this took me about 4 years to figure out how to do this, sort of using the weed guide a little bit, starting with that, and then putting a lot of information on biology, non-insecticidal type of control, trying to make it more of an IPM guide, a holistic guide, rather than just a list of pesticides. So tell me what you think, send me corrections. I'm fine. So Phil asked about armyworm. I haven't had a call in one whole week. Bye, Tilly. I haven't had a call in about a whole week. So I figure that these suckers are pupating now. Will moths emerge? Yeah, I assume we'll have moth emergence maybe in about 10 days or 2 weeks, depending on the temperature. Will they lay eggs again? Yeah, they may try, but they've got to mate and lay eggs. And this is a tropical insect, remember. So I just can't see how we would have enough degree days here to have yet another infestation. But, again, this is the first outbreak I've ever seen, and the first outbreak that we've had in about 35 to 40 years, or maybe even longer, that this pest has been able to move from south to north in such numbers. So I would for sure, if you have grain fields or forage fields, get out of the truck and look when they look good, and don't wait for them to look like sticks. And but I'm fingers crossed this was the end of it.
We always like good news, Chris.
And both the forage and the dry bean sections, the reason I'm a little late is last week I went and updated those and added fall armyworm on the insecticide tables. So this has really proven the point to be able to control the guide and have it in a Word format that we can make a PDF, and it can just be changed right on the fly. I know that Christy and Aaron were looking at their weed guide and how to make that a little bit more responsive rather than just, printing it once a year. And this has already proved itself, the ability to change this very quickly.
So I think Jeff may have hopped off already. I've got a question in the chat for Jeff. I think he may have had to leave to get to his class. So Bill, I will forward your question on to Jeff, and maybe he can address that next week. All right, I am not seeing any more questions in the chat. So thanks everyone for joining, and look forward to seeing you back here next week with Marisol.